It's lovely to be with everybody and already to be part of what's turning out to be a discussion. I'm still absorbing your wonderful talk, Paul, and as others have said, I'm looking forward to studying more closely because there's some very interesting ideas in there, and also thank you in that it is energizing. And in itself, I think, shows ways forward. I wanted to thank you very much. It's very powerful, and I'm still taking it in. So I wanted just to start by thoughts that come to mind about what you said, which will lead into what I'm going to say. When you were talking about GDP, such an important issue to bring up, and it put me in mind of the economists working on care economies now, who absolutely make the point that GDP only measures what brings in the money. And when you really look at that and look at it in today's current world, because of massive financial deregulation, to add to the other problems, what brings in the money tends to be destructive. In other words, with deregulation, you get a lack of responsibility and outsourcing of any costs or an ignoring of them that have to be picked up by the planet and by people and by our fellow non-sentient beings. And so GDP is boosted, particularly in a very deregulated context. And that means that we're funding destructiveness as well as funding the destructiveness that is done to the psyche when only money matters. So the care economy actually seeks to factor in carers. Paul made mention of them as including all the literal care work, but also then we would be including trying to factor in value, and I don't just mean monetary value, but wider measures of value that would give care some clout and power. So we need a lot of vitality and natality when it comes to actually sloughing off this, what is actually a deadly measure, to reinvest in care across the board in social systems, and to actually honor, I think, what really gets to the heart of being human, which is our need to be loved and to express our love, and which includes social love. And we need frameworks that can actually help us to do that. And we need a form of economics that is broad enough to help us to do that. So that's, thank you for bringing in the, GDP and just wanting to link it with care economies as well. I also wanted just to, in relation to psychoanalytic study of vitality, and I think I want to take it in a bit more because I think you're saying something quite radical about it, Paul. But I did just want to mention, under the rubric of curiosity, of course, Klein was very interested in curiosity. In fact, she elevated it to having the position of being a basic human driver. I say driver as opposed to drive, but anyway, it was extremely important to her. I think that the dots need joining up, and there's a lot of work that needs doing there. And I'll be also mentioning what I've written about lively entitlement under this rubric as well. I'll come on to that later, but it's very much in this area. So there are lots of other things I could say about what you said, Paul, and I'm continuing to think about it. Just in passing, I absolutely loved what you said about the problematic of hope. So I want to start by with COP26, which I'm sure people in this audience would have followed, and which we've just come out of. And isn't it remarkable that it's like in our current media culture, it's like one of those old past things that we've moved on from and barely remember. That's how the media treats it. I want to talk about two things that really, amongst others, impressed me at COP. And one was a 20-minute video, which you can find. I'll just video Kevin Anderson and COP26. He did a number of videos, but this one was from the middle of COP, where he was reporting. He's a climate scientist, a very eminent climate scientist. He was reporting on the situation where the scientists, after that first day of all the big speeches, were getting together and doing their work and were pondering the cryosphere, which is really in a very, very bad state, and tipping points have been reached. And, it's the one thing that gets me very nervous and should get us all very nervous. Anyway, there they were all together discussing recent data relating to the cryosphere. And it was like business as usual, by which he meant they were talking to themselves. In other words, the physics wasn't really getting a proper look in a connected way at COP. And that's what his subject was. And he referred to what was going on as the green, shiny glow. A state of mind that politicians were caught up in. He called it planet politics. And in this book of mine this year, I call it Planet La La. And one of the interesting things that was added in, excuse me a moment, sorry, I'll just wait for, I've just had an interruption and I'll carry on. Thanks. One of the things that was came into focus in relation to what he called planet politics was, if you like, the cult of celebrity. These were all the big names flying in to Glasgow and then presumably having their meetings and their dinners and then flying out. And I was putting this together with a film I've recently seen, which is about to come out, called Don't Look Up. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's a film about, it's a spoof about climate change, actually, in the climate crisis, with DiCaprio et al. It's not an amazingly good film, but actually I really enjoyed it, and I thought it made a lot of punchy points, and I found it a lot better than I was expecting. And one thing that stuck with me was somebody in the film commenting, well, we've got the workers and we've got the super cool rich, and they are in one group, and then we've got the others. And I thought that was a very useful separation, because the others include all the carers and all the people who care. And whether that's a description at the level of actual groups of people, or it's a description of what can happen in our psyche, where we get pulled into either being super cool rich, which is only for the very few of us survivors, or we get pulled in through identification. That state of mind actually requires us to ditch care, and they become othered. The carers become othered. All the people who actually hold things together and provide a care economy. So that's one thing that really struck me at COP, was Kevin Anderson and thinking about those who are living on planet politics, which is actually a celebrity planet, and how so many people are drawn to want to identify with that. So I would also, in relation to what you were talking about, Paul, I would emphasize the identification aspects and how, and actually the incredible power of Freud's observation that fantasy is so powerful, it can actually change the world. You know, it is remarkable how the extent to which people can be drawn into living a fantasy life through various forms of identification. So that's one thing that struck me about COP. The other one was as the youth were outside COP, but they had some representatives inside the main talks on the day to the world leaders, one of whom was Elizabeth Watuti from Kenya. And she said something that really touched me and a lot of people. And she said, you know, she's been thinking long and hard about what to say to you all, i.e. the world leaders, those with power. And she said, but actually I've realized I can't do it on my own. These are my words. You know, it needs something from you. It needs you to be open to hearing what I have to say. Because without that, nothing is going to get through. And of course, she was talking about the devastating impacts in Kenya and in aspects of areas of Africa, really, I mean, you know, to at people and wildlife and so on with climate and in the global south. And so you had with Elizabeth Watuti and with Kevin Anderson, as it were, standing in for climate science, you had this powerful disconnect being given voice to. So that's what I wanted to bring back from COP, because as we all know, COP failed to arrive with any way forward. I didn't have hope about COP. Just reading the political signs, but nevertheless, no matter how much one doesn't have hope, it's still very hard pill to swallow, and that's why it's important that the work starts now. You know, which is why I think what you were saying, Paul, is also energizing, and energizing for the work that starts now. So with that introduction, I wanted to say something about some of the ideas that I've articulated in this new book of mine, Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis. And they have to do with the main thread that goes through the book is exceptionalism. And so I wanted to just take a minute to say something about what this is, and starting at the very basic level with the exception. And I'll start with the individual, and what I'm saying also can be read with different reasons and so on at the level of the group and wider, and in politics. And so there is we're divided. Psychologically, we're divided. We have a part that cares and a part that doesn't care. I'm being very broad here. Within our more narcissistic part, there's a corner of it, this is my argument, that actually is an exception. We all have it more or less, and it has three main characteristics. The first is, it's a belief system. It's a false belief system, actually, supported by omnipotence. The first is, it's a form of entitlement. I am entitled to see myself as an idealized version of myself. So it involves idealizing the self. Now, once you do that, you actually denigrate the other. It's foundational. And you also denigrate the parts of the self that actually, the more caring, natal, lively parts of the self that will resist the idealization. They all get denigrated. So I think that, you know, if we're talking about shame, I think it's actually linked in with the very foundational act of self-idealization. Because paradoxically, I'll go on to how the culture boosts this in us. It not only shames us, but it sets us up as ideal, to believe that we are ideal. So I just wanted to amplify that bit of it. So that's the first thing. I am narcissistically entitled to see myself as an idealized version of myself, to see my in-group as an idealized version of itself. And then the second thing, and it links with the first, it's because of that, with no justification, just because of that, I'm entitled to have whatever I want, whatever I can possibly have. The third thing, which I think is the most powerful and suffuses it all, just to make a point about the second thing, once you've done that, you've fractured society, because you're going to have more and somebody else is going to have less. So this is an absolutely fracturing mechanism, hierarchical fracturing and vertical fracturing. The third narcissistic entitlement is I am entitled, what's more, to a comfortable psychic life. I'm entitled not to be morally bothered by this. Why? Because I'm me. I'm exempt. And this is the position of the exception. The third is that I'm entitled to use omnipotent wishful thinking. Omnipotent thinking is more powerful than just wishful thinking. It's that you can transform the way you see things in the mind just through an act of thought. It's more powerful than, the Hebraic God, actually, he took 6 days to make the earth, and then he had to rest on the 7th because he was tired, presumably. Omnipotent thinking can do it just in a moment. You can transform things just in a moment. And to give an example that Paul gave in a paper in 2012 on target setting, you can see a problem, big problem, quick fix. I'll set a target. Our government will set a target. We have no intention of meeting this target, but we've set the target and that's solved the problem. It's out the way. So there are millions of examples of how you can solve problems omnipotently. But what I'm stressing is that the aim is to have a quiet life, not to be morally disturbed. Okay, so that's the constellation. And it's a whole organization that also infects the social group. And it's a very damaging organization because once it's been successfully established, it's a perverse organization and a triumphalist one. There is less and less of a caring self and group to rein it in. And in my book, I argue that the neoliberal journey has been to bring about just that disastrous result. It has not only deregulated the markets, it's deregulated the human mind, and it's used what I call the culture of uncare to do that. So if I can, is this pace all right, Farad? Is it in
it's
everybody?
Perfect. It's
okay,
really
fine.
perfect. Thank you.
I don't want to give too much. Okay.
No.
Moving on to the culture of uncare, and then I'm going to return to lively entitlement and the culture of care. So a sip of water. To appreciate what's happened, and I take the strand of exceptionalism, which is being an exception in its political and economic forms, okay, and its wider cultural forms when it infects a whole culture. I trace it, although it's old in human history. It's a strand of human history, and we can see it in many different formations and societies, and it's a part of us. It's a bedrock part of us. When we're in balance, we counterbalance it with a caring part that holds it in check, and I go into that. Okay, so under neoliberalism, which really started in earnest with an ideological, quiet stealth attack by various ideologues who pushed a moral justification for being an exception. And Ayn Rand is the most, well-known of these, because what she really did in her novels, which were really political tracts, is that she said to the wealthy class. You've always had to have a moral problem about your position. Don't worry, selfishness is the way. There's nothing wrong with it. And all her writing really was to justify selfishness. And there's always a bit of truth in everything. You could say, well, we do need a bit of selfishness. It's not a black and white picture, but she basically gave a certain form of economics, which was going to really undermine care and unravel frameworks of care. She gave it a green light. And it's pretty clear that that's why she was so successful, because actually people do care and they are moral. And so it was the moral deregulation that was in a way necessary for the financial deregulation to happen. And, I underscore that because psychology has been so much left out of this story, and you can't really get the story without putting the psychology into it. So we had Ayn Rand, we had Hayek, we had the neoliberal economists. I'm not going to go into that. There's no time in what I'm saying now. But the book does trace out not just those economics, but actually the psychological streak of exceptionalism running through them all. We are justified because we are better than you. We are entitled to have whatever we want, and we can feel morally even superior about this, and it all feeds into itself. So this was the great moral unraveling that went on and has gone on, and has gone on because it's been in a position of power. You can't have, because people care, as well as are uncaring, you can't have this succeeding without there being in place a culture of uncare, whether that's existing inside the individual psyche or it's existing in the group or in politics, at the political process at large. It has to be supported. It's what keeps the bubble, the hovercraft, if you like, afloat, is a culture. And so the main part of the book is really going into the different branches of culture: media, advertising, social group culture, which is absolutely profoundly important here, to sustain this fracturing and to sustain exceptionalism, which has to create in-groups and out-groups. And it has to create, those who are in power and rule, and those who serve. And I mean, it's very basic. It underlines, I think, who was it who wrote on caste? Her name's gone out of my mind at the moment. But anyway, all caste systems are based on this, whether they're to do with, racism, sexism, and so on, exploitation of animals, whatever. It's all, we are better, we are entitled, and you serve us. And it's that kind of mentality that has been ramped up during the neoliberal age, at the same time as, so anyway, the culture of uncare does two main things. It boosts the inner exception, and we've been told and primed to believe that we are superior. Those who actually service the neoliberal economy are superior. And so it boosts on the one hand, and it has mounted a savage attack on care on the other side, so that, care has been so devalued. I mean, I was told, don't put the word care into the title of your book, it won't sell. Sandals and, vegan brigade and, and all the rest of it. And it's still going on now. You can look at some of the attacks on care under the guise of woke. There's nothing wrong with being woke if it means being awake to what's going on in the world, etc., etc. So the culture of uncare enables this to carry on. And in the book, I put forward the idea of the climate bubble as being the most consequential bubble that we've ever had because of its implications and its state. And it's very largely kept in place by the organs of culture, which I've mentioned, advertising, media, and propaganda centrally, methods of distraction, this, that, and the other thing. And it's also very, very centrally held in place by social groups. And this makes climate conversations very difficult. Because they're social groups in which you're in and out. And one thing I would say about shame, which Paul spoke so eloquently about, movingly about, is that shame, as I understand it, is an emotion that is regulated in the group and by the group. Guilt is more an inner feeling. Shame is more a group thing, but there are a lot of group experts here who can. Anyway, so you need a culture in place. This is what we've seen unravel. Now, care is very resilient, actually, and there have been billions and billions of pounds that have to be put into sustaining a culture of uncare. Why? Because people do care, and it resurfaces, and it reaches for air, it wants to breathe, and it's a dynamic system. And so the basic mantra, which is we are by nature uncaring and only interested in survival of the fittest and so on, and we have to be the fittest. There is a part of us that's constantly trying to overturn that message at all levels. The trouble is that it hasn't had sufficient power or room to breathe. And I think what we started to see during COVID in particular was an absolute upsurging of, we've had enough. We see that this empire has got no clothes. We see that it's leaving us unable to breathe in so many different senses. We had the dreadful killing of George Floyd and the uprising, but it was an uprising, I would say, decades in the making. And we saw Me Too, we saw an attempt to undo this fracturing. We saw global social justice issues arising, people's very productive rage coming to the surface. And we've seen a resurgence of lively entitlement. Now, I want to talk about that a bit, and then I'll stop. I think lively entitlement, and what I argue, is that it's a concept that has been really not paid enough attention. Most people, if you talk to them about entitlement, think of it as narcissistic entitlement. But lively entitlement, if you like, provides the energy, the vitality, and the will to power what I call the lively self. And if we go back to a three-way division of entitlement attitudes, and here I do want to bring in a psychoanalyst called Murray, who I think it was 1964, wrote on entitlement attitudes and wrote on them from a psychoanalytic perspective and wove them into a theory of narcissism. I found a really profoundly important paper. He described narcissistic entitlement. He then described non-entitlement. Now, non-entitlement absolutely goes with narcissistic entitlement, and it covers the kind of abjection that the states of abjection, which have been written about as well, that Paul described. Because if you are narcissistically entitled, somebody else is going to have to be non-entitled. It creates a zone of sacrifice. It has to. So those were two. But then thirdly, he described lively entitlement. And this is the entitlement to live a life as a human and what it means to be a human, and with a moral ethic, with a human ethic, and in touch with human struggles, with the human very basic and dominant wish to cooperate, to care, to bring in all that side of things, and to struggle with uncare, to recognize that there is a destructive side of us and to be up for the struggle. So this is lively entitlement. And I think what we've seen during, in particular, but not only under neoliberalism, I do stress this, we saw it, we've seen it under other regimes, we've seen it under authoritarian regimes and so on. There's been lively entitlement has actually had a battering, a cultural battering at all levels. And people have been rendered abjectly feeling not entitled, to the point where we forget that we're entitled to have clean air to breathe. It's a human entitlement. We're entitled to have clean water to drink. We're entitled to be loved, and I mean be socially cared for by a caring enough government that will protect us. We're entitled to express our love, by which I mean we're entitled to engage in politics in such a way that what we really care about, that we're not going to render our planet uninhabitable for the next generation. We actually have a say in these matters. We're entitled, because we don't have a say under current forms of government. We're only there to elect them, and then we're pushed out the way. We're not even told what's going on, what they're actually doing behind the scenes. So where did we lose all our basic sense of entitlement, some of which we've never really known sufficiently as a human species, because I think we've been so under this fracturing. And it's a little bit like, people say, I've said it, and I think, because I heard Naomi Klein say it, it's time the human race grew up, and transcended a more narcissistic position and come into our own and explore some of the actual basic creativity and emotional expressivity that we really have. This can be a very moving, humbling, but moving age that we're moving into. But I do think that we've ignored the issue of lively entitlement. And it first hit me in a big way in 2013. I attended this incredible, I'm going to stop soon, incredible conference called the Radical Emissions Reduction Conference, 2-day conference. It was at a time when any environmentalism was under the cosh, climate denialism of an overt form was still absolutely rampant. And yet, the climate movement had been born. And this conference had experts from all over the world by Zoom in every area. And they were saying, we can ditch fossil fuels. We already have the technology to do it. It's not new technology. We already have it. And people were stunned, actually, to hear this. And what I realized, and also had discussions about in the coffee breaks and so on, was that the culture of uncare had been so strenuous in telling us that we couldn't do without fossil fuels that we hadn't realized that it could be done. And it was really a move forward at that moment of thinking, this is really a matter of human will. It's not a matter of technology. It's a political issue and it's a psychological issue. And that's what actually got me into, really sparked my interest in exploring what is it that's attacking our sense of will to move forward and to emerge from the climate bubble, which is a very difficult thing to do, actually, because, my conception of the climate bubble is that I use ideas from John Steiner's ideas on psychic retreats. So I extend it to the collective psychic retreat. But I also see a lot of similarities in financial bubbles, and also in the work of Susan Long, who described, the perverse institution that led to some of the financial bubbles. So the climate bubble has features, and we could spend the whole time talking about the climate bubble. But when it bursts, and all bubbles burst because they have to, because they flout reality. That's what omnipotent does. Omnipotence flouts reality. It finds tricky ways to get past the real picture. It faces people with a whole series of shocks, and it's very hard on the heart, and it's overwhelming. And, so staying with that is, people need help to stay with that. They need to process it in groups. I don't believe it's best done on one's own as an individual. And that's, I think, where we are now. A lot of people emerging from the climate bubble and being very shocked. And this is my last remark. If we think about addictions are there to, they dull mental pain, and they do it very effectively. That's one of the things they do. And if you go back to the issue of narcissistic entitlement, I am entitled to be in an addicted state. I'm entitled to reach for any distraction, any thought, any formulation that will help me dull mental pain. And the trouble is that all human emotions are dulled, etc., and etc. Anyway, I think what I say actually dovetails with what Paul said, and I think I'll leave it there now to leave time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Another paper that is going to take a lot of time to digest. We actually have quite a lot of time still in this session, but thank you, Sally. That is just, you've made many references, and I hope we can collect them so that we can add them to the end of the video. For example, you mentioned a Cast book, Ayn Rand, Elizabeth Bartuti, Kevin Anderson, Target paper, Don't Look Up, and so forth. So if we could collect those maybe, and so people can access them.
Okay.
But it's just, I want you to keep talking, but I'm sure you will keep talking through the discussion that follows. So just to let you all know, on my screen, I only have Sally, so I can't see you all because I'm recording this. So feel free to speak, unmute yourselves. If you're finding it difficult to come in, then raise your hand, and that'll bring you to the front and we can help you in. So we've got till 5 past, I think. Okay, so over to you.
Hello, hi, Sally.
Hello, Judy.
Hi, nice to see you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for your talk, and for your great book, which I'm enjoying referring to a lot. I wanted to pick up on actually one of the later points that you made about the shock and the overwhelm when the bubble bursts, the climate bubble bursts. Because one of the things that I'm finding in my research is that the therapeutic dyad, as we've come to know it and come to work with, feels insufficient to actually help people process these overwhelming feelings that surface when this climate bubble bursts. And you made a comment that we need a group to help process that. And I just wonder whether you could maybe say where your thinking is going on that, and whether we're having to rethink therapy in terms of what society needs right now, and how maybe therapy might need to be reimagined at this time.
Very good question. I certainly don't see individual therapy as in any way, if you like, a strategy for helping people emerge from the climate bubble, which is, first of all, I mean, there just isn't the resource, and also there isn't the emotional support, I think, to do that. However, this is not an either or. So just to finish that thought, I think that we need to find ways to communicate with groups and also to communicate in the way that we write that can help people process these sometimes unbearable feelings. And we're up against the unbearable now, you know, because of the inaction. So I do think that, I mean, I find, just to stick with that, I think that's the main task at the moment. So, you know, Climate Psychology Alliance is organizing climate cafes where people can get together, you know, any grouping of people where people can talk this through. And these conversations are very difficult. And also, you know, we need to be thinking and writing more and helping more as therapists and as much as we can to help people have these conversations, intergenerational conversations, parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren and children facing guilt. You know, I was on a Zoom where one woman was saying, it was extremely difficult because I had my daughter telling me that she wasn't going to have grandchildren because of climate crisis. You know, these are such hard conversations, and these are the conversations now, unless we're all going to go out with a bang and actually, which doesn't suffering and you know and turn to survivalism. We have a lot of work at the moment, so there is all that work, and I think it's group work. I find solace with groups of people, and I can articulate my feelings better. Also, for instance, on Extinction Rebellion events, you know, and so on, and processing the group together and helping each other. I think it was Donna Haraway, staying with the trouble. Okay. The psychoanalytic concept here would be working it through and staying with it, or not jumping to some quasi-fake solution. So there's that. But on the other hand, therapists are still very much needed, and climate material will come up, and often it comes up in disguised forms. And I think we've really got our work cut out right now, because it comes up particularly at the level of trauma. One of the things about trauma is that trauma interweaves itself, so that if you have a climate crisis, which is traumatic, it is actually traumatic to take it on board, that's going to color your individual traumas. We saw this with COVID. People were having reactivated, you know, individual personal traumas under the trauma, thinking they're going to die with COVID. It also works the other way around, that our individual traumas and also let's bring in our group traumas as well. I'll go on to that in a minute. You know, they rebound on how we see the climate emergency, and they're deeply interconnected. So if we've got a therapist who is climate aware, in other words, who knows there is a real climate emergency, but who is actually open to be on the lookout for the signs that their patient may be in a state of climate trauma, and may also want to be able to try and sort out what belongs to their individual trauma and their climate trauma. This is a very valid exercise, you know, but it requires the person to be, the therapist, to be climate aware, to take it in with feeling, because otherwise they're going to set up, they're very much in danger of setting up the setting as a psychic retreat. With the 2 of them in it, like a sort of Petri dish that's completely sealed off from reality. So there is a role for therapy, but the tasks got harder. And I also think, in addition to that, we are trying to process more consciously generational trauma, racism, sexism, the horror of the death, the sheer volume of death that we've been through, colonialism. We've got a huge amount on our plates at the moment, so we need to be kind to ourselves in terms of the level of the task, and it's because of that level that I think we need groups and group discussions to do it.
Thank you. I mean, I'd love to pick up on some of that, but I'm also aware that there'll be other people that want to ask you questions. So if there's time at the end, I'll come back.
Thanks, Trudy. One of the things I've been thinking about is that at a personal, ordinary, on a day-to-day level, um, I find it very hard to connect, the fact that I have the capacity to say, go out and buy a 53-inch TV or yet another computer or whatever. I find, I have the money in the bank, so I can do that. And I find I can't quite connect that as having anything to do with the forest fires or, the storms and the hurricanes and whatever. And I imagine even people living in Australia in the midst of these forest fires would still go out and buy their 53-inch TV and not make any connection with the consequences. And that's quite a big gap. I mean, intellectually, I might be able to do something, but on a felt level, it's absolutely remote to my life, particularly living here in lovely Devon. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that gap that's in my mind and I guess in other people's minds?
It's I've found what's radicalized me and changed me in that sense is not just doing thought experiments, but actually taking actions. I mean, carbon emissions reductions actions. So once you take an action, you come up against a full stop, you come up against a no, because I think it's very culturally driven, this thing as well, the state that you describe, which I recognize, and also I go along with in various ways, but what's happened is that somehow goes back to the internalization of a growth economy inside us, that we don't have any boundaries. We don't have anymore anything to help us to know, to think about our individual actions scaled up, because we've become such individuals that we don't scale them up. And I do think having an intellectual understanding and sticking with that actually helps to think it through, to take it seriously, one's intellectual understanding. But I think that, again, I think we can help each other in groups to face this. We get no cultural support at all. I mean, during the COP thing, we moved from a piece on the radio, on the news, we'll have latest results from Glasgow, and then we moved to Afghanistan. It's not mentioned that Afghanistan is partially a climate-driven problem. That the unrest in Afghanistan is because of drought in Afghanistan. Now I'm saying, if we had a culture of care, our news media would be helping us and joining these things up. And the more they were joined up, the harder it would be for us to escape into thinking that what we do doesn't matter. And then, of course, we have raging either-orism with, it's the oil industry that's persuaded us that we all need to concentrate on our own footprints. It's all a diversion, so that they don't have to do anything. And that's either or and blame and so on. And I think it paralyzes thinking, this blame stuff. And it's very different to responsibility, to a framework where one thinks, well, I do have a bit of responsibility. Not as much as the oil industry, but I do. And our road during COVID has done something remarkable, which is that we've started sharing things. So we're not buying stuff anymore. We're on WhatsApp and we're saying, who's got a what's it? Because I need to do such and such. And I can see this, it'll either peter out or it will develop into something much less consumptive, But I don't know how to. It's Elizabeth Watuti's thing, isn't it? How does the part of you that is actually concerned and feels your share of responsibility, you meaning all of us, how does it get to enough power and clout to influence the other part of us, which is definitely there?
Actually, you just mentioning Afghanistan brings to mind that in all these calculations, apparently the military is not counted.
Yeah.
So the contribution to global warming by bombs, planes, and so forth, that isn't part of the equation. I only recently heard that, and that's quite a shocking thing to hear. So
absolutely. And just to add in, I can't give a reference for this because I don't know where I found it, but I had several references somewhere. The military, the British military, does that on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is predicting a 3 to 4 degree rise in temperature. So it knows what's going on, and it's quite fabulous, actually. You have to be in a pretty crazy state to think that's all right.
Yeah.
Well, it's more than that, isn't it? Because they say it's a security hazard or risk. So they acknowledge that it's a security risk. But I wanted to come back to this question of I think you called it hierarchical fracturing.
Yeah.
The split that Farhad was asking about, and it was making. Well, I guess I have two kind of really strong feelings. I mean, aside from I've really enjoyed reading your book and referring to it and giving it to other people. And one is the sense that the bubble, which is really powerful, and I understand it. I feel it physically because I'm a migrant into Europe, and I came here to feel safer, and I did feel safer for quite a long time. But what it makes me realize is actually a lot of the world doesn't feel like it's in a bubble. A lot of the world feels extremely exposing, dangerous, unstable, pretty much all of the time. And Paul started with the coup in Chile, and I'm from Argentina, and in Latin America, there's both the absolute permanent danger, but also the way that you become part of a safer bubble is exactly the same kind of splitting, because Latin America has been doing colonialism for longer than other parts of the world. And so there's this kind of colonial mentality where you can sort of create an exceptional bubble where you can not care and not notice what's going on. So I just wanted to come back to what you said about groups, because I was reflecting on the fact that the only reason I've been able to think about the unbearable has been with others and listening to others and being in an affinity group in XR, or originally being in a group with Black and Indigenous Latin Americans in 1992, when it was the 500 years of Columbus arriving in the Americas, and beginning that conversation of, how do we all feel about the fact that this is unbearable, and what can we do about it collectively?
I find myself thinking alongside you there, partly because I love Latin America, but much more for today, because right through both speakers, there's been an image in my mind, which came when Paul started speaking about natality and vitality. The vitality in the millions and millions and millions of people walking across the world. And our as a society, a culture, our absolute denial of their lively entitlement. Yeah. And how small that makes me feel, and how tearful, but how bloody helpless.
Yeah.
Excuse the bloody.
Thank you.
Well, I think the word bloody is very apposite, actually, isn't it, for what is happening? Yeah. Your thing about exceptionalism, we've had a wonderful recent one of that with the Christmas parties. You know,
Oh.
it doesn't apply to us. We're above it all.
Absolutely, but you know what strikes me even more is the state of mind that seems to hover around the Westminster thing, that is actually a bit off the ground, because they're not paying attention to the reality either, you know. And when you go into bubbles, they are very peculiar things. I mean, different parts of the bubble, different subgroups in the bubble behave differently, but people go a bit crazy inside bubbles. Yeah.
But also there's this linkage between shame and power. And Norbert Elias talks a lot about this. So we feel shame in relation to our betters and the ones who we don't feel shame. So one of the things Elias talks about, for example, in the Middle Ages, in the books of etiquette, that sitting on the toilet, you won't feel shame if your servant walks in, but you would feel shame if somebody of the same rank or above you walks in. And that's something that's, with neoliberalism, that's what's happened, is that they become so powerful, they need not feel shame, because what the hell, it doesn't matter.
And I mean, Elias talked about that division between the haves and the must not haves, you know, which is just exactly what you're talking about. And exactly, I agree, how to shame people into, I don't know if you want to come in here, Paul, but how to shame people into feeling inferior and therefore not entitled to live a life. I wanted to say something. I mean, the unbearable is a subject that, you know, needs a lot of staying with, actually, because I've been very struck by was a talk that Jonathan Lear gave a while back, where he was talking about the unbearable, and he was saying, you know, why do we assume, this is my way of putting it, his ideas, why do we assume that that the human mind can bear everything? We have a lot of trouble with individual death. I don't think the potential collapse of the planet is on the same death, it's on the same level as individual death, because I think that's another subject. But, you know, some things actually can be unbearable. And if we put that together with, you know, issues of containment, and what becomes uncontained and can't be contained, you know, I think we need to do a lot of thinking about what can we bear. Because, okay, so I don't know how many of you know Kate Raworth's donut economics. I've got some nods, but not everybody. So just imagine an American style donut with 2 rings, and she's an economist, and the outer ring is planetary systems, our life support systems, and the inner ring is human factors and what humans need to be able to survive. And there's a safe space for living, which is between these two. And then you look at the actual situation where the outer ring of the donut is looking jagged with various sections, parts of it have been pushed way beyond the limit. This is where you get to tipping points and so on. And if you look at the inner ring, that one is going past the limit as well. So, you know, I think the really urgent issue is, how do we create societies with strong enough frameworks of care that don't allow us to transgress boundaries, where the boundaries are actually pushing humans past what they can bear?
Yeah.
Okay.
दिल से तुझको बेदिली है, मुझको है दिल का गुरूर। तू ये माने के न माने, लोग मानेंगे जरूर। ये मेरा दीवाना पन दिल